Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I want to share with you how to coffee dye paper. So first, let's talk about the setup. I am working on plank flooring. It's like the vinyl plank flooring, so it's pretty waterproof. It's also easy to clean up any spills. If you're working on carpet, go ahead and put like a plastic sheet down to protect your flooring if you're working inside. You can also do this outdoors. It's just too cold where I am. And I have a folding table set up with a fitted sheet over the top of it to absorb any extra water. Now what this table is going to be a landing place for all of my paper as it comes out of the coffee solution. It doesn't look like a lot of space and it's not, but I'll show you how to make this work. I did not want to bring out a bunch of tables, so I am going to show you how I made this small space work for quite a few pieces of paper. So once I have that set up, it's time to move on to preparing the solution and dyeing the paper. For my little area where I'm going to make this coffee solution, I'm using a roaster pan. You can use any kind of pan you want. You just want to make sure that it has tall sides to hold your water. And you can use any size. The only thing you want to make sure of is that you can completely submerge your paper. You can do any size paper you want. So if you're just doing small book pages or 6x6 papers, the 8.5 by 11 sheets just won't fit in the smaller ones. If you're using larger sheets, go ahead and grab a roaster pan. They're fairly cheap and you can use this over and over. Now, for my coffee, I am using instant coffee. This is just Walmart brand classic roast instant coffee. If you use real coffee, your results are going to be different. It's going to give you a different color. Different kinds of coffee will also give you different colors. If you choose to use tea, if you choose to use green tea, it's going to give you a different color. I am using this instant coffee. It's going to give me more of a very dark, almost gray look to my papers in some spots. And then it's also going to give me some really nice browns too. So it's giving me an aged look, but play around with your different coffees, your different instant coffees. You can use leftover coffee grounds, whatever you have on hand, but you're going to want to mix that with some hot water. This I have just put into my electric kettle. I like to have this in my craft room for a lot of different reasons. I not only drink hot water during the winter, um, but it's great to have on hand when you need to do something like this. You can warm up the water right next to your desk and you're not worried about spilling it on you. I did not heat this to boiling because I want to get to it fairly quickly. So I did heat this up fairly well, but enough where I could put my hands in it. And then I'm going to test my water with my pH strip. This is completely optional, and I'll show you why. I put quite a bit of instant coffee with this. I probably put about half a cup in there, maybe a little bit more. And with my water, that only made this solution slightly acidic. Water is your neutral. That's where you kind of want to be. Now, if you want to, you can add baking soda. However, you have got to be conservative with it. I added maybe a teaspoon, maybe a little bit more to this roaster pan, and it's filled up fairly full. It's about halfway full. And I added a little bit more than a teaspoon probably. And look at what it did to my paper. It completely changed the pH of this. It took it almost to the other end of this when I didn't need to go that far at all. You need to be very, very conservative if you're going to add baking soda. If you are not making your things to last for generation after generation after generation, don't worry about the acid that this coffee is going to add to your paper. But if you are and you're worried about the acid, add a little bit of baking soda. And I'll show you how much by I mean a little. So I put some distilled water into this little jar, and here I'll show you with the test strip. It comes out to a neutral. So you're right at your 7-ish. And then I'll go ahead and add some instant coffee. So I have a tablespoon here. I'm not adding a full one. I added about a half to begin with, and I'll just go ahead and stir that up, let that absorb into the water. And it wasn't quite as dark as what I made my previous solution. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more. And for my second round, I added probably a whole tablespoon. So I'm at about a tablespoon and a half here. And I'll go ahead and mix that up. Now, once that's completely mixed, I'll show you what the pH is here. And it is just slightly acidic. Not much, just barely. You're about one number off from your neutral. So it went to about a 6 here. Now, once I did that, I started adding baking soda in quite literally pinches. And I'll show you what each pinch did. One pinch gave me back to my neutral. Two pinches started going very much into the base area. And then once you get to that, it's hard to come back. So if you're going to add baking soda to make your solution less acidic once you add your coffee, do it conservatively and continue to test. Those pH papers aren't very expensive. They're about $5 on Amazon. I'll leave a link down below. And just add in little bitty, maybe fourth of a teaspoon increments until you get to the right pH that you want to be at, which is a neutral. All right, so let's get to the fun part. Let's move on to dyeing this paper. So I've got my solution ready. It's time to start dunking my paper. You can use any kind of paper you want. I'm going to start off with just regular 20-pound copy paper. This is what you would put through your printer. It's what you normally use, like if you were at work or something and you're just printing off documents. This is just that kind of paper. Now, as you can see, I do not have gloves on and I'm using a chopstick to dunk this. If you are going to go places after you do this, and if you don't have a few days to let your hands kind of mellow out, put on some gloves. I had brown stained hands for a few days because I didn't put on any gloves. I didn't want to walk upstairs and get them. I was being a little lazy. But if you don't want your hands to be dyed, just go ahead and put those on. Now, as for the paper, once you get it in, I like to put mine in either in small little batches, little clumps, so like 2 or 3 sheets for this type of paper, or sheet by sheet. If you go sheet by sheet, you're going to get better coverage. However, if you put them in little clumps, you might end up with more white spots, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. Now, if you do put them in clumps and you want to get the water completely through, you can start separating the sheets as they're in the water and letting the water flow in between them. Now, once I have them in for just a little bit, I go ahead and take them out and take them over to my table and put them down on that table to dry, and I put them in stacks at first. So here I left these in a little bit longer, and just to get that water all the way through, I'll go ahead and separate them a little bit. Now, once these are wet, they do get a little bit harder to work with. You need to be gentle with them. The thinner the paper, the more easier it is to tear it. The thicker it is, the better it does in the water, but it doesn't absorb the color as quickly. So just watch what you're doing. Now, next up, I'm going to do some cardstock. This is 120-pound cardstock. And when I'm using this thick of a paper, I will put it in sheet by sheet. And that's going to give me the best results. Also, this is a thicker paper, so I will leave it in just a little bit longer and let it really absorb that color. And then once I have all the color that I want on there, I'll go ahead and transfer it to the table and put it in a stack to dry. I did both white and craft cardstock. You can do any color of cardstock you want. Now, on those same lines, you can also use construction paper. This is just Target brand, I believe, construction paper. And it is so bright and vivid here. And this is one of the favorites of mine. I didn't think this would turn out, especially watching it kind of come out of the solution. I didn't think this one was going to do much. However, I absolutely love the way these turned out. So make sure you stick around to see the results. You can also use book pages. So these are from an old, I'm guessing, history textbook. And I just found it at Goodwill. It was like $1. And these are coated, so they're not going to take on too much color. If it has a slick kind of coating on the paper, it will resist the water a little bit. And I put these again in clumps, And as I'm putting these in there, I'll go ahead and separate these just to make sure that water gets through all the layers, especially on really thick coated paper like this. It's not so important on the thinner pages that are just straight paper. However, on thicker pages like this, you want to make sure that you get the water in between those layers. It just won't absorb through. You can also use printed cardstock. So here's a little postcard that I got from Pearl Soho, I believe it was, a yarn and fabric company. A really cute little postcard that I decided to coffee dye. It's a nice thick cardstock. And these are old encyclopedia pages. Again, these are from I picked up at Goodwill. I really wish I would have picked up the whole set. I only picked up about 4 books, but the pictures and the way these really dye, they are beautiful. The maps in them dye beautifully. And again, I just put these in clumps, kind of push them down, let them soak for a second, pull them out and transfer them over to my table and let it go. Now you can also use old book pages. So here's another book I picked up at Goodwill, one that I will never read. And it's an older one, and I just kind of deconstructed the book, and these are actually 2 pages together. So I took the binding completely apart and kept the pages together as signatures. And so I have these, and these run beautifully through the printer after you're done dyeing them. And I will show you that at the end of the video as well. If you do want to see a video on deconstructing a book and how to do that to keep them in pages like this, I will make a video on that soon so you can kind of see how I kept these together. Now, next up, I've got some more book pages. These are already a little aged. They're beautiful as is, and I really didn't know if they would do much. However, with the instant coffee, it takes on a new tone. So if you're looking at your pages and you're like, well, it's not really the tone I wanted, throw them in a coffee bath. It makes them a little bit darker. It really brings them to life. Now also, you can use old workbooks. This is one I picked up at Goodwill, but I do have some that like my kids brought home from school that we will just never, ever, ever use. We won't do anything with them. Tear them apart, throw them in a coffee bath. You can tear them up into paper scraps. They're really fun to use on projects. Now also, as you are doing this and you're throwing all this paper in, it's absorbing that water. If you're doing a huge bunch of paper like I am today, you're going to need to refill. I like to do it while some paper's in the bath. It'll kind of take on little speckles of the coffee that I just poured on top, and it's a really neat look that you can get as you refill your bath. So I sprinkled in some more coffee, heated up my water again, and I'm just going to pour this right on top of the paper. Now this is a thicker paper I am doing this on. Don't try and do this on a thin piece of paper. It will tear it and it'll just kind of disintegrate with that hot water going right on top of it. But on a thicker paper like this, it's okay, and it will absorb some of those kind of streaks that you're getting. Now again, even with that extra water, it's still really far into the base area for my pH. So use that baking soda conservatively if you're going to add it. If you're not planning on keeping these forever and ever and ever, don't even worry about it. Now here I have some sheet music. This is from an old violin book. Again, Goodwill, it was like 25 cents. So I tore it apart and threw it into the bath, and I'm going to let these soak for a while. These are thicker pieces of paper. The printing on this was also a little shiny. I wasn't sure if it was going to run, but it held up well through the bath. The ironing is another part, and we'll get to that in a moment. I'm also doing just some loose leaf paper. I have quite a bit of this left over from homeschool, so I just took a little handful of it and threw it in it as well. Let it soak for just a little bit. This is a thinner paper, so you do have to be a little bit more delicate with it. It can rip fairly easily. Now, if it does rip, don't worry about it. It's a nice little vintage look once it does rip. And you can just iron out those creases, or you can just end up ripping it apart and you have a couple pieces of paper. I went ahead and pulled that out, set it off to the side, and now I'm going to do some composition notebook paper. Again, on the homeschooling side, my kids used composition notebooks for different subjects, but they didn't fill up the whole notebook. With composition notebooks, you can't really tear them out and reuse. So I just got this extra paper in them. So I just tore them out and thought I'll just copy dye the extra paper that's left over in it instead of it going to waste. So I tore those papers out and I'm dunking them. This is a thicker composition notebook paper and it does have a little bit of that slick feel. I also did some graph paper and I left the little squigglies on the side of this from the binding. And I love the look of it once this comes out. Now, with these printed papers, the composition didn't run. However, the graph paper and the regular notebook paper, the grids and the lines, the printed lines, did run. So kind of play around with the different papers. Yours might run, yours might not. It depends on what kind of ink was used to print the paper. Now, talking about printed paper, you may be looking at all this and you're like, that's great. Book pages are great. I don't want to go spend a bunch of time at Goodwill. Maybe you don't have a Goodwill next to you. Maybe you just want to use what you have on hand. You can print and you can dye that paper. And here are some images I printed. Now, the thing you have to remember, if you print with an inkjet, it's going to smear. However, if you print with a laser jet, it will hold up so well through this. It doesn't smear, it doesn't run. I have been looking for ledger paper, old ledger paper forever, and I haven't been able to find any. So I thought I'll just make my own. I went ahead and printed off some ledgers onto just regular printer paper, threw them in a coffee bath, and I'll show you what the result was at the end of this video. This turned out beautifully though. I also went ahead and printed off some dot grids like you would find in a bullet journal. These turned out so lovely as well too, and I can't wait to make a little journal out of them. So I went ahead and just threw these in a dot or into the bath, the coffee dye bath. Now, as for these, again, they are printed on regular computer paper and they are printed with a laser jet. An inkjet will not work. If you don't have a laser jet, send them to your local print shop and have them copied off. They normally print with a laser. Just make sure that it is printed on with the laser. This was one of my favorites. This is a gorgeous book. It's like the complete guide to herbs and spices. Again, one I found at Goodwill. And these have some really gorgeous watercolor flowers painted in them and herbs and different things. So I will be cutting these out to use on different projects. So I went ahead and just, again, through all of these. These are very thick and they are coated. So these aren't going to take on a whole lot of color, but that's okay because I didn't really want to dye those images too much. So I just let these sit for a second and then pull them out. Again, the longer you let them sit, the darker they're going to be. Now, a few more things you can do to really kind of make these your own. Here's a look at them all on their little, in their stacks on the table itself. And on each top one, or not each one, but a lot of the top ones, I just take a few more of those little extra coffee sprinkles, the instant coffee sprinkles, and I just sprinkle them around on top. These will absorb through. If it's a thin, it'll absorb through a few layers. If it's a thicker paper, it'll just be on that top one, and it creates a really lovely effect on those papers. You can also pull some up and put them in between the layers. It's a really fun look. You can also take a little, you can also use a pipette to soak up some of that extra liquid and just drip little sprinkles around on top of the papers. Again, you can pull up and do them in the layers. Here is a look at all of the papers. I left these on this table to dry overnight. These are soaked, but these are all in big stacks. Now, again, I left them to dry overnight for about 24 hours. I think I came down the next morning. Maybe it was more along the lines of 12 hours because I finished this in the afternoon. And I just let them dry overnight like this. They will not be completely dry. However, the next morning, I started taking them apart and laying them one by one. At this point, they were just damp, so they weren't going to get my floor soaked and they weren't going to dye my floor at all. There was no chance of that happening. They just needed to kind of crisp up, let off that extra moisture. So I put them on my floor to dry in a single layer. And I did that a couple times. If you don't have a wood floor, you can put these on the table. Just go ahead and take those sheets off and lay them on that table to dry out, or take them outside. Just make sure they don't blow away in the wind. Or you can put a plastic sheet down and lay them on top of that. Just make sure that you're laying them in that single layer to dry fully. But this is a way to get by with a little bit of space. Now moving on, once these dry, they are going to be crinkly. You can leave them as is, but while I'm doing this, I like to just take my iron to them now. That way I get my iron out once and I don't have to get it out again. So I just go through, it takes about maybe 20 seconds for each sheet, and I just quickly iron these. Now you do have to be careful with some of these. The majority of these, I think actually all of them iron beautifully, except for that music paper, and I'll show you what happened with that in a moment. So I just take my iron, I put it on a pretty high heat because I am an impatient person. I don't like to wait around for this to really warm up very, slowly, warm my paper up slowly. I like to do it very quickly. So I turn it up pretty high, no steam, and I just iron these out. Sometimes they'll have a few little crinkles, sometimes they'll have some creases. That's okay. This just makes it a little bit easier to store them so it's not so bulky, because the creases are fine for just one or two papers, but as you get a stack going, it takes up so much more space with the creases in it. So I like to just go ahead and iron these. It makes the stack nice and neat and easier to store. The cardstock does take the longest, it is the thickest, but the thinner papers just take a little bit of time, quick iron over them, put them in a pile. Now the construction paper, just this one, the blue one, is the only one. I did add some heat to it. It turned a little bit of a different color. I remember my Stampin' Up paper doing this back in the day with my heat gun. It did turn back to the original color, but it was just a weird little thing that happened. So I thought I would show you. If it happens, no big deal. These are going to be essentially vintage papers anyway, so a little bit of color changing isn't going to matter. But if it happens, it happens. Now the music paper is the only paper that did this, but that ink is a shiny ink. You can see it in the video as I hold it up. You can see it's a very shiny ink. And as I was ironing, it did start to smear. Not a ton, but you can definitely see it. Now, these weren't that wrinkly anyway, so I just didn't even go ahead and iron them anymore. However, if you really want to go through it and iron it, just put a piece of like parchment paper on the front and back and go ahead and iron it, and that should help with that smearing. So let's take a look at some of the results. These are just my favorites. I'm not going to show you all of them, but let's take a look at this postcard. I love the way that turned out. I also thought that would be really fun to do with like vintage photos that you may have. Print them off onto some cardstock, dip them in a coffee bath, and it'll give you that same look that this has. Just leave that white border around it, and you've got yourself a vintage photo. So fun. The book pages, again, they all turned out really well. You can see where some of these touched as they were drying, and they've got that really nice gray color on the edges. Super fun. The maps in the books turned out really great. The coating ones, like these, didn't turn out near as dark, but if you want them to be darker, just use uncoated paper. These are some of my favorites. I love the way that when you drop water, it leaves those splotches. That's really fun. Again, coated paper, not so dark on these. However, here's some uncoated paper. You can see how much of a difference you get. You can also just get the edges when you put them in a pile and you pull them out and you don't go in between each one. You can get some nice splotches on there just from dropping that coffee on there. Really, really fun. Those are the old encyclopedia papers. Now look at this. This is the Crayola construction paper or Target brand or whatever. Very, very bright and vivid to begin with, but look at what the coffee did to it. I love the way these turned out. I want to do a whole stack. And construction paper is so cheap. You can get it at the Dollar Tree for $1. I mean, I love, love, love the way this turned out. And it held up really well too. As you go through and you do these, you will notice some of the papers get more brittle, but the construction paper really didn't. Here's a look at the composition notebook paper. I love the different looks of these. These are so fun and it held up really, really well. This was the nice thick composition paper. Then you have the notebook paper. Again, really beautiful. You did have some of those lines transfer as they were drying and smear, but I just love the look of it. You also have the graph paper. Now, the majority of this did fade, and it did lose a lot of its lines. However, you still have like the ghost outline of it, which I think is really neat. And I left those little frillies on the edge and just ironed those out. It turned out beautiful. I also have my regular computer paper. These are fun, especially when you need to do a big bulk of it for like a journal. You can do all of these, fold them in half, and use them as your signatures. Really, really fun. And I'll show you that in another video coming up. I also have my cardstock. You can use any color you want, but here's a look at the white. It turned out beautifully. And again, I love those edges where it touched and then some of the ones with the sprinkles on them. And then you have the craft, which I kind of really went to town on the backs of those, and I love them. These turned out really nice as well. I also have my printed paper. It turned out and held up beautifully. No smearing at all with this. Just make sure you use that LaserJet printer and make sure that your toner is set on there. It turned out really, really lovely. You could also foil those because toner printed. Then you have your music paper, some more of the book pages that turned out gorgeous. And I did want to show you, here are some of my printouts. They did look a little weird just printed off, but once you cut them out and you kind of rough up the edges with some scissors, you can use your fingernail or you can use that Tim Holtz tool that does roughen up the edges of paper. It looks so lovely and so neat. I love the way those turned out. If you don't have a LaserJet printer and you do not have access to get them printed off for you, you can print on these afterwards. Here is just a regular piece of computer paper that I did print on after it had been dyed. I did iron it so it was nice and flat to go through my printer. I did print all of these with my laser printer, but it would go through an inkjet just the same, and you don't have to worry about any moisture getting into contact with these and running your inkjet ink. These are book pages that I printed off onto. These are so fun. I love the way these turned out too. And coming up shortly in another video, I will be showing you how to use these and also all the rest of the papers in different kinds of projects. Because if you're like me, you find a fun project, you do it, like coffee dyeing paper, and then you're like, but what in the world do I do with all of this paper that I have now? So I've got some projects coming up to show you how to use these. So make sure you check back when that video comes out. That is going to do it for me today. Thank you guys for watching. All the supplies I used today are going to be listed down in the description box below. Happy crafting, everyone!